You're listening to the Forest School podcast with Lewis Ames and Gemma Southerden.
Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is the afternoon. It's a rainy afternoon.
It's really rainy, but I'm quite enjoying it. We've had a very, it's un-PC, isn't it? We've had a very screen-heavy day. We've watched like 2 films. I think the third one is on downstairs to keep the children occupied while I'm doing this. And just like, you know, we talk about in our house having sun guilt. Do you have sun guilt in your house?
Oh yeah, if it's nice weather and then you feel guilty for being inside.
People in other countries are going to be like, "What are you on about? It's sunny 300 days a year. If it rains, lovely." We're like, no, British people. If it's sunny, we like have to go out and burn ourselves just because.
Take your top off. Take your top off in a park and have a disposable barbecue and set the lovely landscape on fire.
What a start.
Happy days. Yeah, tomorrow is going to be torrential, and that is our unlimited screen time. Go for your life day. Already got it planned. Mom, can we watch YouTube? Yep. Go for your life.
Which is absolutely fine. It's child-led.
We're not talking about screen time on this episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
Oh wait, we're talking about
this one.
We're talking about the book Feral by George Monbio. And I have to confess that I started reading it a couple of months ago because I saw it on Audible as a thing like coming soon. And I was like, "Ooh, that looks really cool. A brand new book." And I've only recently, after reading most of it, found out that it's actually from 2013. And I think what happened was... Oh, is it? I think what happened was there was the audio version of it was new. So, and it is George Monbiot reading it on Audible.
It is linked on Amazon with Wilding as a you should buy these as a package, which having read it or listened to it, I was going to say I completely agree, but I haven't finished Wilding, so I can't really make that call. Together, you and I have read both these books.
Yes. And I can't remember whether Isabella Tree references Feral or George Monbiot in Wilding, because I read it quite a long time ago. If she doesn't, that would surprise me, considering it is a book about rewilding that was written before hers.
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying that like my sort of 2-sentence summary would be that this book is... I think most people are aware of the book Wilding. For those that aren't, it's a lady who took her farm and basically decided to raise wild cattle on it and try and return the land to... in Feral, they use the term self-willed. So they're kind of... It's not putting in human things. It's just going like, let it go. Let it return. And I've always understood that or been told that all land is trying to be forest again in Britain. If you leave it long enough, all of what we do and what animals do is just suppressing forest because it wants to be a forest again. So what I think is interesting...
Sorry, can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
But that's generally what we're led to believe, and led to believe that the whole of the UK was this incredibly dense forest, right, in the past, before humans had that much impact on the landscape. But in Wilding, she goes on for a long time about like something pasture, or can you remember what it is?
I know the term you mean.
Mixed grassland and woodland, basically.
It's like a coppice pasture or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like and she explains that idea of Britain being covered in dense forest is actually a complete myth, and with the large animals living at the scale that they did, that they would have suppressed some tree growth. So you would have had like clumps of trees and then loads of like mixed grassland, because the animals would have eaten the young shoots of the trees, and the only trees that would survive are those that would grow in brambles and stuff.
More like when you see a savanna. A savanna, it's clumps, patches of trees, and then a gap, and then another big clumpy patch.
Yeah, so she sort of manages her farm like that, doesn't she, and puts those animals in to do that.
But what I think is interesting is that I think this book is... some people say about books is like they work when they found their moment, they found their time. They could be saying the same thing.
Zeitgeist.
Yeah, and I feel like this book is if Wilding is, say, level 1, this book is level 5. And it's interesting that this one came out first, because I do think if the concept and the sort of media publicity that Wilding had made it quite mainstream, particularly for outdoorsy people. And I can see that before that, if you had just read this book might come across as like, so this book is very, I would say, passionately arguing and campaigning for absolute self-willed land, and talks all this stuff about, we reintroduce native species or close cousins of native species, animals and plants, and just says if they don't work, then that's fine. We only have to do it once, and then we go, okay, they couldn't survive. The habitat is not right for them anymore.
But what I liked about this book was that it also very clearly says you shouldn't do that to any piece of land willy-nilly,
Yes.
Whatever, that's not the most important thing.
Be forced.
So there's lots of stuff about kind of the human price of that, isn't there? Lots of stuff about land that's been stolen from native people on this like proviso of this is a reserve now. So you need to get out, and your way of life now ends, and you are not going to be paid for this land, and like atrocities being, acted upon native people. And he even sort of extends that to Wales. I really like that bit where he goes to visit a Welsh mother and son, and they tell him about the kind of traditional farming practices in this bit of Wales, because he kind of goes in there with very like anti-sheep. He like hates sheep, doesn't he? That's the funny thing throughout the whole book. Like he calls them the white plague. That was really informative. I had no idea about the kind of destruction that sheep
the wool
can cause.
trade and how much that influenced that. Because the price of wool meant that we went right. Get
Completely.
Applications for Forest School training are now open at childrenoftheforest.com. Check out the podcast links for more details.
And the fact that so many national parks are full of sheep, so the Lake District and Peak District and so on, and it's claimed to be like a completely wild habitat, when in fact the sheep destroy most of the native plants there. And one that he finds that there's more there's a better variety of wildflowers and plants on the road verges next to the national park that he's been visiting, and finds a complete native desert. But yeah, this bit where he goes to Wales, and his viewpoint's kind of challenged, isn't it, when he's kind of up for rewilding this bit of land, and they're like, hang on a minute, people have lived here for hundreds of years, it's already really hard to live here, but we're trying to kind of protect our ways of life and honor our kind of customs and stuff. And he's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. And so he is very balanced in that way. And I also quite enjoyed the bit about the Nazis, the bit about like eugenics people being like, there's that link, that really like appalling link between people who are like, yeah, wolves and big cats should roam free again, we should like reintroduce them because they are like the best species, and actually a lot of human life is valued below that of like the wild wolf, but only some humans, like and the bit about the woman who the film Born Free was written about, who raised lion cubs. I've forgotten her name now. And in the film, it's like, oh, she's such a wonderful heroine saving these lions. And in real life, she's like basically a white slave owner in Africa, like
off the land,
who gets killed by her own servants.
If we just unpack, because you've kind of gone blah, 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 and I think there's lots to unpack from different bits of that. So if we go back to the bit about Wales, that was a really interesting. It's quite late in the book, and I think that's quite an interesting bit, because it's interesting that it's a very well structured book, in that by the time you get to this chapter about sheep and an actual kind of rubber meets the road, let's go and look at some landscapes kind of thing, you're already, say, 6 or 7 chapters in of him going, look, this is the reason, and this is why, and this is some history, and this is some stuff, you're already on side with him. And so I think it's then an interesting bit where he goes, I went and talked to these people and I came away absolutely confused. And he says he was basically in his head holding both viewpoints of, he still thought the land should be returned to self-willed, but he also thought, so they talk about these Welsh families are talking about the fact that the written history records what happens to the rich and the wealthy and the powerful,
Yeah.
And the land is what's writing the history of everyday people. And there's a great bit where he's talking about there's a pub in this valley in Wales, and he said someone would walk through the door and they would just say the name of a rock, and someone else in the pub. So all the rocks in this Welsh valley have a name, because when they moved around and followed their flocks, they would need them as landmarks. So there's no writing on them. They just know that's Big Tom. That's, sheep.
Wasn't it like they hid their hat there or something? A bit like
so they
early
put their hat
geocaching.
there, and then you would get the pint when you brought back that person's hat. And so just this. So he's saying, I think it's very interesting, very poignant that he brought it. He didn't just go, there are no reasons to do this. Not to do this rewilding thing, he actually considers the other side, and I think it's very, it's very well done. It shows a level of humility to go, well, I went to these people and they challenged me, and then the next chapter is him going, after I thought about it, these are my counterpoints, and I have since sent them. And it's this little dialogue. He says, I sent them to this Welsh family, and this is what they've said back, and this is, so I thought again, and this is so. I do think, like you're saying, it's a very interesting book that he is very passionate and mentions it in almost every chapter, that he is not an advocate for, I can't think what the word is now, like consolidation and, the government coming in and saying, right, you cannot have this land because we're going to do this national. He's like, if the people who own the land aren't on board, one of the things we can do is then to convince them to talk to them. And actually, I think it was very well thought out when he views things. And it's something that I have been in contact with for a while, which is this idea of, and it's quite poignant now, is EU subsidies for land and for farmers. And that whether they are open about it or not, the majority of agricultural farming, like livestock farming in the UK, loses money. It actively loses money to run that as a business. But the EU subsidizes farmers for their land. It subsidizes them on the price of their product. It subsidizes them on all these things. And so he kind of talks about this idea of this idea that what's good for the farmers is then assumed to be good for nature. Because we all, justify our own self-interests, whether we do it consciously or not. He's saying, lots of the ecological trusts and things will say, well, grazing is important because it brings more diversity in, or, the cattle have been here for X many years. And so he's actually looking, I think, at lots of different areas of that decision-making and going, right, well, if you didn't have subsidies, so it's one family farming 600 acres, say, and he's saying, you didn't have all these returns.
He talks about changing the subsidies, doesn't he? And because a lot of it's nonsensical, and it's one of those books that I found, I mean, you have to be in the right mood. Like if you're feeling a little bit down about the state of the world, like listening to certain chapters are fine, but certain chapters are just like make you want to bang your head against the wall, because he challenges things that are in policy, doesn't he? And goes, where's your evidence for that? The evidence is literally the opposite of what you've written. Like he's talking
there was
to
an MP,
ministers,
wasn't there, who gave him some evidence, and he read the evidence, and it said no sheep should not livestock graze here, or something like that.
The opposite of what she told him it had said. And then he goes, so what do you say? And they basically shrug, and it's full of things like that. And the same where he talks to the people that are managing the national park that he visits, and is a complete sort of nature desert, and he is getting really angry while he's walking around, and gets very sort of has quite negative feelings towards the people that are making these decisions. And then when he sits down with them, actually they agree with him, and they know that what they're doing is wrong, but they don't get their funding unless they do it. And it all goes right up to government level. So it's loads of people sort of should be all working in, along the same way.
I felt like one of the most compelling bits is that he's saying that lots of these farmers were talking about preserving their way of life. And there's two parts to what he then said, which was that one was that he was looking at how long ago are they preserving something from? Because he was saying, actually they're preserving farming that is 100 years old, 200 years old. You take the time span of a country and a wildlife and an ecosystem, it's completely arbitrary that we just go like that's what we need to preserve. But he's also talking about, and this is very relevant to us in the West Country, where he's saying that people are very concerned about the kind of diminishing need and, I guess, patronage of things like village pubs and local groups and small communities that can thrive a thing. And he's saying, well, that of course, if one landowning family can farm 600 acres and can receive all the subsidies that come for that, there is no social infrastructure that requires a pub, a post office, a bank, or whatever. And he then talks about, well, one of the options would be rewilding. And he said that then opens up an industry of nature walking, of archery, and he talks about,
jobs available,
and all this stuff that you go, actually, if you had a large area of rewilded land and you encouraged people from urban areas to visit, you just have this massive thing then that just builds, and then that's where you support the pub, because there's 15 people working instead of 2 people who can, plow however many miles. I did think it was interesting as well, him talking about, again, very pertinent to us, deer stalking. And I don't know if you would remember this bit, because he kind of brushes past it quite quickly. But he's saying that people will say that they need to cull deers because they will overgraze and they will do all these different things. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, we said, if you deer stalk, as we do now, there's a season, and people pick a certain type of deer. They particularly want big deer, which interestingly, he says, has led to smaller and smaller deer because the big ones get shot and can't have more children, all this stuff. But but what he says is the ecosystem has to support the entire herd. Is herd the right word? Herd, until it is hunting season, stalking season. He said, if you introduce wolves, a wolf has to take a deer every week, every whatever. So he said, actually, the ecosystem does better because it's not supporting 50 deer and then shoots down to 2 deer or to 10 deer or whatever. He said that is a constant and manageable way of managing a population.
That's a bit like
and having better crop. Crop yields will be up.
Yeah, it's a bit like trees having mast years. Where the trees all communicate and go, okay, yeah, there's a mast year every 4 or 5 years, but quite randomly. So that keeps the population of the wild boar and other animals that would have eaten the tree's seeds to a lower level, so that they don't eat the young saplings and the seeds and so on, because it's irregular and it's so they know that the population can't be sustained to a level that's damaging to the environment. I found it interesting. There's loads of statistics in the book, aren't there? Loads of facts.
It's very dry to listen to at points.
Some of them I kind of were like, oh, I really want to remember that though. So similarly to the beginning of Wilding, which is just full of the most depressing statistics about the numbers of species that have become extinct in Britain, in the very recent past. I thought it was interesting that he talks about 40% of the species that have become extinct since 1800 lived in woodland, and 2/5 of those needed mature trees and dead wood. And in his opinion, it's all about woodland and wetland, which is relevant for us and relevant for all of the stuff that's happening, well, up until the pandemic, about tree planting. That was a real drive, wasn't it? And I wonder whether we will get back to that at any point soon. Definitely in the UK, there was a massive drive recently to plant loads of trees, and especially here in Devon, lots of kind of groups of volunteers getting together and planting loads of trees, and about the impact that will have.
My experience, and they could be anomalies, but some of the groups that I have spoken to, in passing, people are very when it becomes known that when it becomes known that you go, oh, Lewis owns a bit of land, right? Immediately, tree planting groups go ding ding ding. Let's go and talk to this man. And then when they find out that it's woodland, they're like, oh, okay, we don't want that. We want empty land, pasture land to reforest, I guess. But I'm yet to find a group who, and it could be a budgetary thing, it could just be a way it's structured. But I'm always, when I chatted to them, I'm yet to find a group that have thought about their tree planting in anything longer than 5-year terms. And I would be interested to know groups that are different, but my experience is that lots of this tree planting initiative was around the good feeling that you get by putting trees in the ground, and trees have gone in, and now there's 600 more trees in this village, and that's fantastic. And then I said, well, okay, so how often do you check in on them? What's your management plan going to be for, you're going to thin them out in alternate years? You're doing whatever? And they kind of go, oh, well, once they're in, then we leave it, and whoever the landowner is, then it becomes their responsibility. And I kind of go, okay, well, as soon as that's convenient, they're going to get rid of that, because they're going to be incentivized financially to do something else.
That's the thing about you. You're so optimistic, Lewis. It's really...
I am optimistic. If you could put in place, I think one of the things that I really liked about this Ferrell book is that he gets into the mindset, and you very quickly, so I think you go with him quite quickly in this idea of, he's talking about trees being planted and environments and all this stuff. And for one, I can't remember what the example is, but he's asking someone and saying, will this be long enough for these trees? And he said, well, it will last 250 years, and that seems to be okay before we start putting the, before we even think about touching it, it's 250 years. And so that you get into that like long-term massive time frame, which is something that I think we're losing. My experience, if I think about things in history, there seems to be a lot more examples of people having a sense of time that is different to the sense of time we have now. So in terms of, there's that story, isn't there? I must have told you the story about the Oxford Great Hall. Have I told you about this thing?
Don't know.
So Adam, that works with us, told me about this story. And apparently, so the main roof beam, this huge thing, it's like an oak beam or an ash beam or something, and started to rot. And the university kind of were working out how they're going to rebuild it, how they're going to, is it going to be concrete? They're going to get another timber thing, whatever. And couldn't work out what to do. And eventually they just kind of got around. And the groundskeeper, because Oxford University has this massive estate and forest and all this other stuff, and the groundskeeper had a log, and he knew where the tree was that they put in 400 years ago when they built the original Great Hall. And he went, oh, no, I know where that tree is. And they've done that, and then they since kind of unlocked this bit of knowledge, and he knows where the roof beams are growing. He knows where the and then similarly, so it's that kind of time frame. And I always look at big cathedrals and things and think, you have to be a mason that looks at that and goes, this may be the only thing I do. This may be the only bit of masonry I do, and I might not see it finished. And I might, they're just such enormous, what is it? The Gaudi Cathedral, still not finished. But having that sense of time and going, one day this will be great, and that we are. Yeah.
And so you think that's lost now?
Think not lost, but possibly rarer than it used to be.
Yeah.
And there is more of an emphasis on, it sounds really cheap to say like a quick buck, but
I know what you mean.
Support the podcast today by becoming a Patreon member at childrenoftheforest.com. Check out the podcast links for more details.
And that is definitely true of things like HS2. So that's the whole argument about HS2, isn't it? That they're going, oh, it's fine though, because we're just going to replace all those trees. In fact, we're going to plant more trees than the ones we're cutting down. It's like, it's not about the number of trees. It's about how ancient they are. And it's about the fact that these ancient habitats are unique. And once you get rid of them, they're gone. It's not just a matter of like, oh, we'll plant a tree for a tree. That is a whole ecosystem and potentially loads of species that you're really endangering.
It's the logic of someone that doesn't engage or understand ecosystems is to go, a tree is a tree. Because we who spend time with them, and it's like anything, isn't it? I'm sure there are farmers who go, a sheep is not just a sheep. They're all different. Or
but that's also the thing, isn't it? That a lot of the landowners aren't the people that know that information. So damage is done all the time. So in the beginning of Wilding, Isabella Tree talks about the oak trees on her estate near her house, and she calls in a specialist bloke to come and look at these trees, and she's really worried about one particular oak tree, which is very old, and the boughs nearest the ground are really like completely flopping down towards the earth. And she's going, what can we do? Do we need to prop these limbs up, or do we need to cut the tree down? Like, how, And he's like, nope, that tree is completely fine. That's exactly what it should be doing at its age. Like the ancient trees, they let their boughs rest on the earth and they carry on going. That's probably got like a few hundred years left to it, and it will gradually flop. And that's the whole point, that's its natural life cycle. She's like, oh, okay. And it's like, what do you really want to be worried about is those trees over there where you've been ploughing right up to the roots of the tree and letting cows stand under them for shade, and that tree is going to fall down really soon because you've made it really, really ill. And she's like, I had no idea. How are people supposed to know that? But she is the custodian of those really, really valuable members of the natural world, and she doesn't know until she happens to get this bloke in. So it's terrifying. I did find bits of the book terrifying in that way.
Oh yeah, but okay, so this is my favorite bit about this book, and when I heard it, I like immediately went and told my wife. Trees, my wife, trees that you typically find where elephants live.
That bit,
right, where elephants live right now, there's the predominant type of tree is trees that can survive being coppiced. And by coppiced, you mean ripped down to the roots and can regrow from that. So like conifers can't do it, as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
No.
But things like willow and hazel and things like that are coppice trees. And he is saying that is entirely plausible, that those trees are defending themselves from elephants, that our hazel and our willow and all of our coppice hedgerow is defending itself from an ancient elephant that used to live in this land. And
it's an evolutionary response to elephants in
which
Britain.
Is incredible.
I love that
bit. And I do think that is, once he explains that, and he explains that in a very real way, and then a few times later in the book he talks about wanting to reintroduce elephants, or he talks about Europe essentially losing its megafauna before other continents did. And one of the reasons he says is that in Africa, the megafauna, lions, giraffes, elephants, rhinos, hippos, all those things, evolved and developed alongside the human species, and so at a certain point you stay away from those guys. They are mental, right? They're walking around doing whatever. But he likens it to the dodo, and says that when where is the dodo anyway, when explorers arrived at the island with the dodo had no knowledge that it needed to be scared of them. And so then he goes into this really fascinating kind of part of like history where he says humans would have migrated slowly and would have constantly come across megafauna that looked unbelievably scary but didn't know it was supposed to be scared of them. So these kind of European elephants that would have just not run away from early humans, and so we then wiped them out. But they had been there in influencing the flora long before we arrived. And then he ties into storytelling, and I love this bit where he says that is probably where lots of myths and legends of dragons and beasts and all these things come from, is early people already reliving the tale of their like grandparents that they could no longer get. So their grandparents wiped out the European elephants, but they're no longer European elephants anymore. So now they tell stories to their children of like, oh, we used to fight these great beasts and these whatever. And so that then just becomes part of our culture, that humans fight these enormous beasts. And Western storytelling has this tradition of, Grendel or cyclopses and all that stuff.
Dragon slaying
and stuff that you go, could that evolutionarily come from us beating the crap out of some megafauna and just knocking it out? And then, but then, interestingly, he talks about rewilding elephants and says, you would need all this connected stretches of wood of forest.
Yeah,
So you'd
corridors.
have these like corridors up and down the country. And then he says it would be interesting as they migrated that you would, he's sort of jokingly talking about like a news report saying, the pollen count is up and the elephants will be reaching Norfolk later this week. And people just going like,
God.
fuck, the elephants are coming. Oh, okay.
Amazing. Yeah.
And imagine Spring Watch would be incredible.
Oh yeah.
Just
how
all
cool.
of that nature TV stuff. And I think he's quite open. And what I do like about this book is he puts together a very factual argument for rewilding certain species, and in a certain part of the book he just lists the species and says, elephants, I give them a score of 8 out of 10. They need but they don't need this. Wolves, give them this. Bears used to live here, but I'd give them a 2 out of 10 because they need this and because public perception is this, blah, blah, blah. He lists them all out, and there's loads of them, and he talks about, I love this book so much. It talks about he does talk about aurochs, and he talks about is it storks or oh no, it's a type of bird.
Crane.
Is it? Yes. And he says that everywhere in the UK that has cran, that's where the name comes from. It's from crane. It's the brook. Also, we have Cranbrook near us, and although that's a modern development, Cranbrook would have been the brook where the cranes are from. So Cranberry, Crannock, all these places, that's where cranes come from. I've lost my train of thought now. Oh yeah, so he's talking about these animals, rewilding them in a very factual way, a very logical, and saying, it would be better for this, and actually it would cost less money, and it would be great for the environment. And then every time he finishes the paragraph, and he kind of just goes, and I would be lying if I didn't say it's partly because I think it would be exciting to see elephants outside, or I think it would make going for a walk so much more exciting if I knew that there were wolves, or
it was like super exciting for me this week to go to our local river at Colmstock and see a little egret, and I'd never seen one before.
Oh, wow.
And I spoke to my dad about it, and he was just like, oh yeah. But when I read about it, because I was like, I think that's a little egret, and looked it up, and they're tiny white birds really, but they've got long lanky legs and long beaks, and they stand there and spear fish, and you're like, well, that's not a heron. It looks way more like kind of tropical than a heron. And that's a species that used to be really common here, and then they became extinct in this country apparently, according to Wikipedia, because people wanted their plumes, which are at the back of their heads. They got the sort of like a mullet sort of haircut, or like a rat's tail feather at the back, and they were hunted for that feather for hat making, for millinery, and that's why they were made extinct. They became extinct, and but they're back. But they're only sort of last 20 years have been breeding here again. So to see one was just like, oh my God, and even the kids were just like, what is that? So yeah, you can imagine that you suddenly see like a huge crane on the river. It'd be amazing.
Do you know, this isn't to do with this book, but it does kind of link. Do you know the thing about birds of paradise and their origin of why they were birds of paradise?
No. So
in the age of taxidermy and bringing things back to the court of Louis the 16th and all this stuff, the birds in Papua New Guinea, the explorers couldn't get anywhere near them. The only place they could get near them were the tribes people that lived in Papua New Guinea knew how to catch these birds, and they would make them into headdresses and literally just put the bird almost whole on their heads. But the first thing they would do is they would take the legs off to make it into a hat. And so the only taxidermied versions that came back to the courts in Europe had no legs. And so they went, these birds have no legs. They must be born in flight and they must never land. And they must, so they're called birds of paradise because Europeans thought they were birds that just never landed, that they were in flight their whole life, and they mated in the air and they gave birth in the air. And it was just because they never had any examples with legs, which is a really nice kind of like, you just make it up, don't you?
Yeah.
We're all just making stuff up.
I really like the bits in the book because it's sort of like twos and fro's between all of this sort of quite factual stuff, and then going out and exploring and meeting other people and talking about policy. And then these chapters which just go off on one about his own feral adventures.
Oh, yeah.
Like the book starts, doesn't it, with him just talking about how like tame he feels like he's become, and like the greatest challenge in his life is like opening a badly designed packet of nuts, and how he just like needs some wilding in his own life, like he needs to rewild himself. And so he moves out of London, I think, to Wales, and there are these like really descriptive bits where he's off in his kayak, like or diving and catching spider crabs with his bare hands, or and often in quite risky situations, like in his kayak, and then there's a massive storm and he's miles away from land, and real kind of elemental forces that he's playing with, and just being completely at the mercy of nature. And I really love those bits, and I thought that was quite kind of a bit of a challenge, almost a bit of a like, well, I've done this and I've found places and spaces where, although the species have diminished and the opportunities have diminished, I've still got out there and found spaces and times where I felt feral and felt like I am catching my own food and I'm using my own hands for these things in a way that much earlier humans would have done, and how important that is for kind of your soul, really. And I was trying to think about whether there was any space in our lives where we get that feeling. And if there isn't, like, could there be? Do you know what I mean?
Recapitulative.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all children
Completely.
are doing. That's our favourite thing. Recapitulative play. For people who are unaware, is the best type of play. No, it's not the best. It is. It's the play of reenacting or living out the lives of your ancestors and of ancient things, and
fire
and face painting,
stamping around,
and life and birth and death rituals, and all those things that you go, those kids have gone feral. That's the stuff that we each to their own. But when you and I see it in our setting, I think we both have a bit of a like, love that, let's do that some more.
So cool.
What
about as an adult though? Like, I was trying to think and reflect, and as an adult with a young family and a job, and we live in a rural part of the world, but we don't live at the bottom of a mountain where you can just like stroll off and be in a completely wild place. And I think like the only times I can think of having done that recently, like, I don't think being at work counts.
No, it's different. Too cushy.
What he's and it's planned, and you're with other people, and you're not having that true, like, you haven't gone feral when you're running a session. I don't think. Often, sometimes maybe. There's a bit of my garden which has what we thought was like an old whetstone mine in it, and turns out it was a bomb shelter made by people who lived here in the 40s, because some bombs were dropped on Exeter and accidentally round here on some farms. And so the people who lived in our house were so terrified that they dug a bomb shelter into the side of the hill, but it looks like a long tunnel into the hillside with what looked like kind of pit props of wood holding a corrugated roof up. And I was just like really fascinated by it and completely drawn to it. And I didn't really want to tell my family much about it because I didn't want my kids to go in there, and it collapsed on them. So for a while, like, Ed knew it was there, my other half, and I was just like, go and have a little explore around there and just have a little look, and like shine a little torch in, and I'll just go a little bit up the hill and just see what I can find. And then and I'd just be kind of rootling around in the woods by myself, basically kind of looking for like clues of human activity from the past, and then I'd like hear my name being called like up the garden, because I've been basically gone for quite a lot longer than I thought I had been, and they're like, what are you doing? And my only answer would always just be playing, because I would be playing. Like, I wasn't kind of out there for any real reason. I wasn't on a walk somewhere. I was just sort of pottering around this like weird little area of my garden. But apart from that, like, I can't think of a time where I've experienced what he's describing.
Well, see, that's interesting, because I took a similar thing, but a different, maybe a different branch of that experience. Just when you asked me that question then, and we said, what do you do that's real? And so I immediately then had to categorize in my head, okay, well, what is she talking about? When do I do what? And I went down the route in my head of the risky experience and the like. It's just a very, very heightened experience of proprioception and interoception, and this like you are using your body to do a thing, right? This like high level, and I do think there is something, which is probably why it's quite addictive to. If I'm in the gym and when they're open and I'm putting 3 times my body weight on my back and I'm going to bend down with this, and you get to the bottom and you cannot be thinking about anything else. You can't be worried about what your partner said to you the day before, or you can't be thinking about what am I doing later. The only thing, it is that absolute singleness of purpose that comes from knowing that, like, if you cock this up, there's a couple of 100 kilos is about to land on you. And he talks about I can't remember what they call it, but basically that, like, in a predator prey situation, if the predator gives up, they have lost their meal. If the prey gives up, they've lost their life. And that is something that we don't get very often on either side. But I do think being physically challenged in the way that I would do with weightlifting, I do think that is close. And then if I'm completely honest, I think that is partly why I enjoy big building projects with the kids in the woods, because there's, like we were saying when we were doing some building the other day, there's something that is like, I have made this. We made benches earlier. We got timber from a shop and we drilled it and we cut it and we made benches. But at the end, I think we both were a bit like
oh yeah,
we made benches.
Yeah.
But there's another bit that, like, part of why I think tree houses are addictive and fun is that to build a tree house, you have to put yourself into a physically risky situation. You can't build a tree. I'm sure you can. And I know, like Tom Barden and the guys, they ran a like tree house making course.
Yes.
So I'm sure
Simon.
Simon, that's it. Simon Tech. And I'm sure there are ways you could go on a course, I don't know, I didn't go on the course, so I don't know if this is what you do. I'm sure there are ways you could build a tree house from the ground and, pulley everything up, and it would be very safe, and you'd secure this and you'd be from there. That's not how kids build tree houses. Kids build it by, like, I'm going to climb this and I'm going to hold this with my foot, and you shimmy along to the left, and you give me that give me the rope now, give me the rope now, give me the rope now. That is an element of just being absolutely consumed in it, and it's possibly where children's play has that, like, we talk about sometimes, like, part of the play is saying, like, stop, don't get me, I hate this, whereas you need to have a word that you just go, like, is that part of your game? Is that part of your play and role play? Or
oh my God,
are you genuinely not enjoying it?
That is really doing my head in lockdown right now. 2 children who, like, it just confuses the heck out of me. I think maybe it's harder when it's your own kids.
Yeah.
But everything's harder when it's your own kids. But yeah, they need physical rough and tumble play. And it needs to be real to them. Not like, oh, I'm going to poke you with my finger. It's like, I'm going to kick you in the guts, like, really hard. and then I'm going to kick you back in the guts really hard. And I'm going to put all of my body weight onto you. And that's, like, part of the game. It's not just like, push you over. And it literally goes from blood-curdling screams and cries of, Mum, I can't breathe. Make him stop or make her stop. And then, so I'm like, Ollie, I've got to get on this. And then laughing, like a millisecond later, absolute torrents of laughter. I'm like, I just don't know where to even begin with this.
Sounds like good cardio for your heart, though.
Maybe it's fine. But yeah, it is that kind of, like, you can see the kind of fear, absolute terror in the eyes 1 minute, and then just laughing and running away. Like, oh my God. Yeah. It's all good. It's all good.
It's all good. Can I go back to stuff of, like, the start of the book? So I really loved I was maybe 20 minutes into listening to this book, and I immediately wrote down, this is an incredible book. This is exactly how I feel about veganism and this idea of just leave stuff alone as much as you can. If you can, leave ecosystems alone, leave flora and fauna alone. I think there is a benefit to that. And then I thought it was an interesting bit where he I can't remember if he mentions a study or if he just sort of works it out by roughly what hunter-gatherer tribes do in other countries. But he says the UK could support a population of hunter-gatherers of roughly 5,000 people.
Wow.
And then
at the moment?
No, at its peak, if it was like fully rewilded ecosystem,
right,
doing all this stuff in terms of, if no farming, hunter gathering, 5,000 people, and the evidence suggests that like pre-farming. Oh, that's what it was. So he's talking about pre-farming. That is what.
It was like a population cap, wasn't it? It was like a kind of
that is what the island can support, which is then very interesting to kind of carry around in your head. If you think about what are they currently in the country, it's like 6 million of us, 7 million of us. I think that's right. Is it? How many? Take a guess now.
No, I don't want to.
Oh, another guess. Okay, 66 million people live.
I was going to say 60, but because you said 6, I didn't want to look like a complete fool.
Oh no, do you know what it is? Is maybe it's 6
but who's the fool now? Who's the fool now?
Anyway, 66 million people live on this island, and or island and a bit of an island, because we've got a bit of an island. 5,000 is the cap, is the hunter-gatherer cap, which is really then interesting to then look at and be talking about removing things like sheep as a food system and removing all this livestock and going, actually, that it just doesn't feasible to keep feeding and to keep employing this many people. But then he kind of moves a little bit, and I loved this bit. He says, feral isn't a static state of being that's being protected. It's ongoing systems and changes. And that is something where he talks about ecological baseline. Your ecological baseline is defined in your childhood as the level of flora and fauna that existed and were available to you as a child. And that is mostly what people feel like they should return to. Not many people can engage with the idea that that is actually a reduction of what it was for their parents or for 100 years ago. And so that links into this idea of farming and people going, we need to preserve the way we've been farming on this land. And you need to go, right, but you're preserving what your childhood was. And we all do it for lots of different things, don't we? We would all, I think, without kind of consensus study, we would probably all think that the level that we were allowed to roam on our own as children was the norm. And that you go, well, what I was allowed was exactly right and not too much and not too little. And what children are allowed today is either too much or too little, because it isn't.
Yeah, and the terrifying thing of that, like, shifting baseline syndrome also affects scientists. So Isabella Tree talks about that in her book as well. So when they're, like, measuring fish stocks, for example, or species have become extinct in the UK, it's proven that scientists also are doing that and going, okay, well, when I was born, this is what the levels were, and they've plummeted to this.
It's talking about in the 70s, everything apparently is from a census in the 70s.
1970,
Fish stocks in the 70s were already something like 300% lower than they were in the 50s. And so people go, oh, well, we've got it back to, 20% of what we... And so this is a really interesting bit where he was saying that in areas where there are protected marine conservation areas, which there are surprisingly few of around the world, they then become actually natural sort of feeding spaces that allow the rest of the fishing industry to carry on. Because if you don't fish in these bays and coves, then the population will grow there, it will get bigger, and it will have to move out of the cove, and you catch it outside the cove. And as long as you don't catch the bit in the cove, it's a bit like taking something off a sourdough starter, because we're all in lockdown and we're all having sourdough starters. You keep the starter going, don't you? And you just cream off each time. And he's saying that would actually allow for much more sustainable fishing if you set up these complete conservation no-go zones.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause. I need to go to the loo. So you have written a note about, very zeitgeisty, the Tiger King.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, that's kind of in a bit about what he's talking about, issues with some people's attitudes to welding I mentioned earlier. So people being fans of rewilding, but also being fans of eugenics, things like that. And a millionaire who built zoos in Kent and fetishized tigers and encouraged his keepers to just like hang out with the tigers in their cages because, you know, they were noble beasts. And then loads of his keepers were mauled to death because he told them to do this. And
but did any of them have a rich husband? That's what we need to know. Is
yeah, so that was the sort of like, don't just go, oh yeah, big animals are cool, actually, you know, and happen to be a right-wing asshole at the same time. Give it some thought, you know.
Give it some thought, yeah, and
give
it's
it a
kind
bit
of
thought.
It's interesting. There's a bit, so linking to that, then I guess there's a bit. He's talking about the rewilding of. I'm gonna say I think it's beavers. It's beavers.
Yeah.
And he is saying that beavers are beneficial because the dams that they build restrict the water flow so that you don't end up with such severe flooding. They keep the systems, so outside of their like dams, they actually keep the waterway quite clear. They do all this stuff, and he was saying about the objections and the sort of I can't think what the word is. The kind of like the farming community around wherever these beavers were being reintroduced, and saying that they were absolutely against the idea of beavers, even in this conservation zone. And then, they happened to get out, and maybe it was people let them out, or maybe they got out on their own. But saying that it was stuff like, you know, farmers literally saying that they didn't want the beavers because they were going to eat their crops, despite the fact that beavers don't eat crops. They eat, you know, they chew the cambium off of wood and stuff like this, and just absolutely nonsensical kind of gut reactions to these kind of species coming back. But that in the book, again, I think it's a very good book in that he doesn't dismiss them as like, oh, those stupid people with their stupid ideas, they don't know anything. He kind of says like, the job of people who want to do rewilding is to change public perception and is to get people on side with this and to show the benefit, not to just go, you are wrong and I am right. This animal is going in, which is, I think, you know, in some ways this book is quite radical because it's suggesting some very big changes, and you know,
I think it's very radical.
But the approach isn't radical. Do you know what I mean? The approach is very go and meet the peoples of the community. Go and you know, this might be a 250-year project. Let's talk about how do we keep people in business by changing the subsidies rather than just going, you know, get rid of the subsidies. You're living off the, you know, it's that argument, isn't it? That you could levy living off the state at many different swathes of our communities, and some would take it better than others.
Find out about CPD courses at childrenoftheforest.com. Check out the podcast links for more details.
I was just going to say something about species that have been reintroduced and are doing well. On the 30 Days Wild website, which is happening at the moment, I was just trying to find it, but I can't find it right now. But anyway, if you register for 30 Days Wild, then you get access to their website, and there's a whole section on being able to watch live webcams all over the country of like ospreys and puffins and loads of stuff like this. And I think he talks quite a lot about ospreys, and he uses them as the example of a species that has been reintroduced in certain areas and the amount of money that they've made from tourism, wildlife tourism. Like everybody wants to see the ospreys. So areas that were really deprived and have been completely rejuvenated just by a pair of ospreys, basically, as people spending loads of money on these nature holidays to catch just a tiny glimpse. But if you want to see some osprey chicks, you can see them on a webcam.
Oh.
It's very cool. And peregrine falcons and puffins. We were watching a little puffin today
at some point, doesn't he? He says pelicans have come back, and he kind of lists some examples of like there was a pair that nested here on a abandoned phone line, but then they took the phone line down, and there was a pair that nested on like an old oil rig or something, and then they got rid of the oil. It's a nice example of a species naturally trying to reintroduce.
Mm-hmm.
He does as well talk about the idea. He says it's very important to not just be looking superficially and go, oh, we used to have a bird with that was white and had a long neck. So there's this other country or this other continent with a bird with a like long white neck. We'll get that bird. He
Mm-hmm.
talks about like looking at the whole animal. What the size of it? How much does it roam? What is it hunting pattern like? All those things, and trying to say, and says, some of them might just not be a good fit at all, but that we need to consider more than just like, we have bones that look like an elephant, so we should just get an elephant, just put them back, be fine. It's interesting, isn't it? Do you think there's anything? I guess what I would say is this book is very big in scope, and that comes with it being quite a radical book. Do you think there's anything that you, after however far you got, went, well, that's an actionable point, I think I will take that away and try and do that?
I think probably the bit that I was talking about just now, in terms of trying to make more time to be feral and being more observant of the spaces that I think are wild and actually assessing whether or not they are. So if you visit Dartmoor, for example, and you think, oh, this is, is it actually wild, or is it one of those places that he describes that is touted as being like an amazingly wild space that actually is covered in sheep and therefore is very managed by people?
He talks about, is it the Cumbrian desert?
Yeah.
Conservation
desert. Yeah. And I'd say my attitude to things changed a lot after reading Wilding, because I read that first. So as an example, like there's a field which has been allowed to just do its own thing in our village, like right in the middle. There's a very small little field on the side of the road, and it's now absolutely covered in sycamore and willow saplings and brambles, so that you can't there is a gate there, but it's just, you can't even get in the gate anymore because it's so overgrown. And I know the bloke that owns it, and I was at one point thinking, oh, do you know what, our village is really missing, like a play park and an outdoor space for the village to congregate. And there are some young people in the village that have nowhere to go, nowhere to hang out. Wouldn't it be cool if we had that field and we got a grant and turned it into, have a shelter there for people to hang out, and it could be like an outdoor village hall almost.
Right.
And then I read Wilding, and I was like, no, that is precious. Like, as it is, that bit of land could be absolutely vital for loads of species that, through our very tidy gardens and our trimming of verges and our farming, intensive farming, be putting at risk. That is an absolute oasis for many creatures. So I sort of viewed, and I think she describes a bit in her book about like our view of what useful land looks like. And George Monbiot talks about tidy land, like our view of like what tidy rivers look like, and how people are like have been dragging loads of dead wood out of rivers to tidy it up. And you go, why are you doing that? Oh, to make it look nice, to tidy it up. It's like, you've literally wrecked it now. Like it, trees washing down a river and collecting in a certain place is how many of the species that live in that habitat have survived through that natural occurrence. And here you go, just going, oh, I'm just going to spend like thousands of pounds, which could be really well spent elsewhere.
Look at it.
Dragging it out with a tractor,
It's that hangover of a Victorian gardener, though, isn't there? There was something very Victorian about they kind of, their society thought that they were bringing order to the world, and they liked if you see a Victorian garden, it's very, and it's been preserved.
Maybe earlier than that. Maybe earlier than, isn't it? Oh, I can't remember. I remember learning about this in like English A level, and our teacher kind of, maybe it's like maybe it's Victorian. I don't know. Anyway,
I think it is Victorian because there's one thing. One of the comparisons that I have heard is that one of the reasons that The Origin of Species was so badly received at first was that the Victorian view of the natural world was that it was peace and harmony and everything living in balance and all these things. And evolution of species. Is it evolution of species? Is that what it's called? It kind of paints this picture of like a constant life and death struggle that all of the natural world is in, and it is cold and bitter and unyielding, and that did not sit well with Victorians. Like, tra-la-la, lovely countryside.
Yeah, and I remember, and especially talking about kind of like our view of, well, that land isn't useful if it's not producing milk or meat or cereal, then it's not useful and therefore it's worthless. Like, you're letting that land go to seed, you are wasting it. It's a waste. And her explaining why that's not the case. And I remember while I was reading that, I drove past a field with a huge billboard in it, designed by a development company. And it said, help this land unlock its potential. We give your support to this building project. We are going to cover this land with concrete and build a business centre here. And I was like, wow, the wording of that, like, its own land only fulfills its potential when we have covered it in concrete. And that is just it's like a mindset. And once you have that challenge, you're like, oh yeah, like, why does it only exist to be useful to us and useful in our very specific way? It's just, it's nutty. But yeah, being more feral. That's, swim in the sea more. Swim in the sea more. Try not to drown. Swim in the sea more. That's my takeaway.
Oh, there you go.
So profound. How about you? What's your biggest takeaway?
No, I think my biggest takeaway, I don't think I had anything actionable from it, but I think I came away with more understanding of something that I might have kind of, maybe I had a toe in the water before of like, I quite like when spaces are untidy and a bit, I like ferns and I like things all mismatched. And, I've done some stuff before, some learning about permaculture, which is very much that mix of like, it might not look tidy, but it is very productive, and that mixing all of that together. So I feel like I've come out the other side of this book with like just more of that, more like, well, actually, I'm going to do this, and actually, I have a different view of our woodland now, and its value and its resource, and
And when you've rewilded it by introducing some wolves, it'll be really fun to run a forest school session there as you watch the children run away from the wolves.
We're gonna play hunters and rabbits.
But for real.
No, you don't need a tail today. No. You do need to run.
You do need a gun. Yeah.
That's how you read it out.
On that note.
Doesn't foster long term, does it? How long have you been coming? It becomes like the Hunger Games, the community of survivors. You just go, yes, we're a very tight-knit group. Anyone new that comes. It's that Billy.
That's why the treehouse is going to be like super fortified and really high.
Have you heard the Billy Connolly joke about the news reporter and the lion? There's two it's not news reporters, it's wildlife photographers, videographers, and they're filming this lion, and the lion's giving it a big rah, 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 making loads of noise, and one of the cameramen just bends down and starts tying his shoelaces, and the other one looks at him and goes, "You are mental if you think you're outrunning a lion." And he says, "Fuck the lion, I got to outrun you."
Yes.
So yeah,
right,
that's where we are.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it. We don't have a plan for what we're going to talk about next necessarily.
No.
It's the middle of June. If anybody is opening up their sessions again, I want to say good luck to all of you guys. I hope it goes well, and just stay safe.
Yeah, stay sane.
Stay sane.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen.
If you like this podcast and want to support more episodes, you can donate through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/Children of the Forest to show your support for the Forest School podcast.